There is something you carry with you everywhere, not in your hands, not in your pockets. You carry it somewhere quieter than that, somewhere behind the ordinary thoughts about tomorrow's plans, behind the warmth of the people you love, behind all the small and fleeting concerns that fill the hours of a day. It is the knowledge that one day you will die. Most of the time, you do not think about it. Life moves too quickly, too brightly, too insistently for that thought to stay in the foreground. But sometimes, in the late hours, in the particular stillness that gathers around midnight, it rises, quietly, without urgency, just there, like a shadow at the edge of a candle's reach. If you're listening to this now, perhaps you're already lying down. Perhaps the room around you is dark and the world outside has gone soft and distant. If so, let it be that way. Let the darkness be gentle, because tonight we are going to travel together, slowly, without rushing, into one of the oldest and most tender questions that human beings have ever carried. When did we first know? Not know in the way that a deer startles and runs, not know in the immediate animal flash of danger, but know in the deeper way, the way that stays, the way that changes how you see a sunset or hold a child or sit beside someone you love. When did human beings first look inward and understand, truly understand that the life inside them was temporary, that the people they loved would one day be gone, that they themselves would one day be gone? No one can say exactly. That is one of the most honest and quietly remarkable things about this question. There is no tablet inscribed with the first moment of that awareness. There is no cave painting that says simply, "we know." The evidence we have is scattered across hundreds of thousands of years. A fragment of bone here, a handful of coloured earth there, a shallow grave dug into soft ground long before anyone thought to write anything down. Archaeologists piece these fragments together carefully, cautiously, and they are honest about how much remains uncertain. The story of human mortality is, in many ways, a story told in absences, in silences, in the things that did not survive the long passage of time, and yet something did survive, enough to suggest that the awareness came early, perhaps far earlier than we might expect, perhaps in forms so different from our own understanding that we can only gesture toward them, the way you might gesture toward a light glimpsed through trees and say something is there, though I cannot tell you what. Tonight, we will walk toward that light together. We will move slowly through deep time, through ice ages and open grasslands, through firelit shelters and painted caves, through the first graves and the first gestures of tenderness toward the dead. We will visit the earliest known burials, the strange and deliberate arrangements of the departed, the red ochre pressed into ancient earth as if someone believed that colour could carry something across a threshold. We will listen, or try to listen, for the first myths, the first words, the first stories that human beings told themselves about where the dead had gone. It is a long journey, and we will take it gently. Before we go further, if you are new here, welcome. This channel is a quiet place, a place for slow stories told in the dark, for history that unfolds at the pace of a long breath rather than a racing thought. If that sounds like something you'd like to return to, it would mean a great deal if you subscribed. And if you feel like it, and only if you feel like it, leave a small comment. Tell us where you're watching from tonight. Tell us what time it is. There is something lovely about knowing that someone in a faraway city, or a small town, or a room just like yours, is lying in the dark asking the same quiet questions. Now, back to the darkness. Here is something worth sitting with. Before we begin, the awareness of death may not have arrived all at once. It may not have been a single moment of terrible clarity. It may have come the way most deep understanding comes, slowly, incompletely, in stages. A child watching something still that was moving before, A person standing over the body of someone beloved and feeling, for the first time, the weight of an absence that would not lift. A group of early human beings doing something deliberate with their dead, something careful, something that took time and effort, and in that act, perhaps, encoding a recognition too large for words. We will approach all of this with curiosity rather than fear, with softness rather than certainty. Death is a subject that can feel heavy, and this is not a program that will make it heavier. The intention here is not to unsettle you, but to accompany you through the long and genuinely astonishing history of how human beings have understood, grieved, honoured, and made meaning of the fact that we're here only for a while. That fact is not only sorrowful. Throughout history, it has also been the thing that made beauty feel urgent, that made love feel precious, that made people build monuments, whisper prayers, lay flowers on cold ground, and tell stories in the dark, stories like this one. So rest now, if you can. Let your breathing slow. Let the room around you be what it is, dark and quiet, and yours. We're going back a very long way, and we have all night to get there. Before there was knowing, there was only living. For most of the history of life on this planet, that was all there was. Creatures ate and moved and rested and died, and the earth received them quietly, without record, without witness. For hundreds of millions of years, organisms came into being and passed out of it, and nothing in that vast and patient cycle required any awareness at all. A fern does not know it will wither. A fish does not contemplate the shallowing of water. Life, for most of its history, simply happened, abundant and indifferent and complete in itself. We tend to forget how long that was. How many hundreds of millions of years passed before anything on this earth might have looked at another living thing and felt something in response to its stillness. Let yourself imagine it, just for a moment. An ancient world, before grief was possible, before absence could be felt as absence. Then something began to shift. Among the mammals and later among the primates, something like social bond emerged. Not friendship in the way we would name it, but connection. Real, warm, persistent connection between individuals. Mothers and young, companions who travelled together across wide, dangerous landscapes. Groups who knew one another's faces, who responded to one another's calls. And where there is genuine connection, there is perhaps some version of its loss. Scientists who study the great apes, chimpanzees, gorillas, bonobos, have noted behaviours that are difficult to name without borrowing human words. A chimpanzee mother who carries her dead infant for days or weeks, unwilling to put it down. An elderly gorilla who sits apart from the group after a companion dies, quiet in a way that the researchers who observe these things describe carefully, gently, as resembling what we might call mourning. These observations are recorded not to sentimentalize, not to project human emotions carelessly onto other animals, but because the behaviors themselves are real and they demand some kind of explanation. What do they mean? That is the careful question. Because here we must be honest about what we do not know. An animal may respond to the death of a companion, may feel, in some form, the disruption of an absence, without ever imagining that it too will someday be still. There is a very long distance between noticing that another is gone and understanding that the same end awaits you. Most researchers believe that distance is significant, that the second kind of knowing, the abstract self-directed awareness that I will die, requires something beyond what we can confidently attribute to even our closest animal relatives. And yet, these observations remind us that the roots of whatever we eventually became reach down into something older than our species, the capacity for loss, for response to death, for some form of recognition. These did not emerge from nothing. They were built slowly over vast stretches of evolutionary time out of materials that were already there. Our earliest hominin ancestors, those ancient relatives who walked upright across the African savannas long before anything we would call civilization, almost certainly had social bonds of some kind. They travelled in groups. They cared for their young over long periods of dependency. They recognized one another. When one of them died, the others would have at minimum noticed. The body would have been there, and then it would have been still. Whether they felt that stillness as more than a practical event, we cannot say. The fossil record does not preserve emotions. Bone and stone survive. Everything softer does not. And so we are left, as we so often are in this story, with inference and careful suggestion rather than certainty. What archaeologists look for, what becomes one of the quiet threads we will follow through this entire journey, are the signs that death was treated as more than a practical event, more than simply the end of a body's usefulness, the signs that someone at some point did something deliberate, something that took time and effort and perhaps something like intention with the remains of the dead. Those signs do not appear immediately. For a very long time, as far as we can tell, they do not appear at all. Early hominins lived and died and left behind their bones in the earth, and those bones were scattered by time and weather and the indifferent work of other animals, and there is nothing in their arrangement to suggest that anyone paused over them with anything other than instinct. But the absence of evidence is not quite the same as evidence of absence. It may simply be that the earliest gestures, if there were gestures, left nothing behind for us to find, or that we have not yet found what there is to find. The earth is old and patient, and it keeps its secrets long. What seems likely to those who study these questions with care is that the awareness we are looking for did not arrive whole. It was not a single invention, a single moment when one of our ancestors looked up at the sky and understood all at once what it meant to be mortal. It was more like a slow accumulation, something that gathered over many generations like sediment, building up layer by layer until it became something that could hold the weight of meaning. Perhaps it began with something small, an early human lingering near the body of a companion a little longer than necessity required, a child poking at something still and feeling for the first time some wordless confusion about the difference between sleeping and not waking, a very gradual, very tentative dawning, spread across generations, across thousands of years, that what happened to others would also one day happen to the self. We cannot know exactly when that dawning occurred. We cannot point to a moment on a timeline and say, "Here, this is when a human being first understood they would die." The honest answer is that we do not have that moment. We may never have it. The mind leaves no fossils. What we do have are the indirect signs, the things that people did in the material world that suggest something was being felt or thought or believed about death that went beyond the immediate and the practical. And those signs begin, tentatively, slowly, in ways that are still debated, to appear in the archaeological records somewhere in the deep and largely undocumented middle stretch of our prehistory. That is what we will follow, not the thought itself, which vanished with the thinker, but the traces the thought left in the world, in the earth, in the careful placement of a body, in a handful of colour pressed against cold skin, in objects left beside the dead as though they might be needed somewhere else. These things did not have to happen. That is what makes them remarkable. They took effort. They took time. They were choices, however instinctive, however partial, however distant from our own understanding of ritual and meaning. Something moved in the people who made those choices, something that recognized, in some form, that death was not nothing, that it deserved a response, and so we begin to move forward through time, slowly, as promised, toward the earliest graves, the earliest deliberate arrangements of the dead, the earliest hints that something in our ancestors had begun to reach toward what we might call meaning in the face of mortality. The earth around you is quiet now. The dark is soft. Rest, and let the long journey continue. Before the first deliberate burial, before the first careful arrangement of bones, before any gesture we might recognize as ritual, there was simply disappearance. A body fell. The earth received it, and time, which is patient beyond any human reckoning, went quietly about its work. For most of the span of human prehistory, that is all there was. Not because nothing was felt, perhaps, but because whatever was felt left nothing behind. The landscape absorbed the dead as it absorbed everything else, slowly, completely, without distinction. Rain and root and the slow migration of soil, the attention of animals drawn by scent, the gradual submergence of something that had once been a person into something that was simply ground. We tend to think of the past as a record, as a long accumulating story with evidence at every turn, but the deeper you go, the quieter it becomes. The earliest hominin deaths are known to us now only as scattered fragments. A jaw here, a handful of teeth there, a partial skull lifted carefully from sediment that held it for 1,000,000 years or more. These are extraordinary survivals. They are also nearly nothing. They tell us that certain individuals existed. They tell us very little about how those individuals were received by the people who knew them. This is one of the central difficulties in trying to understand how early humans responded to death. Archaeologists work with what the earth has chosen to preserve, and the earth is a careless archivist. Bone survives under certain conditions: dry caves, alkaline soils, the particular luck of being buried rather than scattered. Soft tissue does not survive at all, and behavior, the thing we most want to know about, leaves almost no trace unless it involved moving stones or depositing objects that are themselves durable enough to last. So when we ask how the earliest hominins responded to their dead, we are asking a question the evidence can barely begin to answer. We are standing at the edge of a very old silence and listening for something that may have been spoken only in gesture, in stillness, in the quality of a pause, none of which fossilize. What we can say is this: there are occasionally patterns in the archaeological record that give researchers pause. Remains found in locations that seem unlikely to be purely accidental. Bones that appear perhaps to have been moved rather than scattered where they fell. Possible associations between hominin remains and particular landscape features. Caves, sheltered places, spots that seem to recur across different sites and different periods. These patterns are noticed, they are debated, and they are held very carefully, because the discipline of taphonomy, the study of how organic remains are transformed, moved and ultimately preserved or destroyed by natural processes, has taught archaeologists to be extremely cautious about what such patterns mean. Taphonomy is, in a sense, the science of misreading. It documents all the ways in which the earth can appear to tell a story that no one actually wrote. Water moves bones downstream and deposits them together in ways that look like arrangement. Carnivores gather remains in dens. Sediment shifts over centuries and brings things into proximity that were originally separate. A pattern that seems to suggest deliberate placement may be nothing more than the slow and indifferent work of geology. This is not a failure of imagination. It is an honest reckoning with how difficult it is to distinguish human intention from natural process when the only evidence is bones in soil, and so the earliest possible signs of any human response to death must be held lightly. Suggestions rather than conclusions, questions rather than answers. What we can imagine, and imagination, held carefully and honestly, is sometimes the only tool available, is the quality of life in those ancient landscapes. Small bands of early humans moving across wide territories, savannas and forests, rivers and seasonal rains. The world around them would have been alive with sound and movement, and they would have known it intimately in the way that people know a place they have walked across for generations. They would have known where water could be found in dry months, which areas were dangerous, which routes the herds followed, and they would have known, in some way we cannot fully reconstruct, where their dead had been. Not the graves, because there were, as far as we can tell, no graves yet, but the places, the spots in the landscape that carried a particular weight of memory. If memory is not too formal a word for whatever passed between early humans when a companion ceased to move and breathe. The valley where someone did not get up, the hillside where a child went still, these places would have been real, even if nothing was done to mark them, even if the body was quickly gone and the bones soon scattered. Whether such places were avoided or returned to, whether they held fear or something quieter than fear, we cannot know. Some researchers have speculated carefully that early hominins may have treated certain locations associated with death differently, steering away or perhaps moving a body to a particular kind of place as a simple response to disturbance. But these ideas remain speculative. They are the shapes of questions, not answers. What seems true, in the deepest sense, is that even without ritual, even without any gesture we could name, there would have been something, some response in the living to the stillness of the dead. Not necessarily grief as we would recognize it, not necessarily understanding, but perhaps something quieter and more primitive than understanding, a hesitation, a disruption in the ordinary flow of attention, a moment when the world seemed to require some kind of response and the response had not yet been invented. The silence of those early deaths is almost complete. Almost. Because here is what the silence cannot quite erase. The fact that the people who witnessed those deaths continued. They moved on through the landscape, carrying with them whatever they carried, their habits, their bonds, their accumulated responses to the world, and in some of them, over time, something was building, something that would eventually produce the first deliberate act, the first unmistakable sign that a dead person had been recognized as something more than an obstacle, something more than a practical problem. We do not know when that shift began. We do not know how long it took. The honest answer is that it may have been happening for longer than we can see, in ways too small and too soft to leave a mark in stone or soil. The first genuine feeling of loss, the first abstract recognition that I too will come to this, the first impulse to do something, anything, in the face of what death had taken. These may have occurred thousands of generations before any evidence of them survives. That is a thought worth sitting with for a moment. All of that feeling, all of that first reaching toward meaning, vanished. It left no trace. It was as though it had never been, and yet it must have been. It had to be somewhere in the long accumulation that eventually produced people who buried their dead with flowers, who painted the bones of ancestors with red pigment, who built monuments that outlasted every other thing they ever made. The silent earth held all of that, patient and unhurried, waiting for something in us to become legible enough to read. And slowly, over stretches of time that resist imagination, something did begin to appear. Not yet a burial, not yet anything certain. But the faint suggestion, the first tentative possibility, that death was being met with more than silence, that somewhere in the dark of an ancient world someone had paused, and in the pausing something had begun, and then, very slowly, the pausing became something more, not all at once, not in any moment we can point to with certainty, but somewhere in the long corridor of prehistory, among people who were either our ancestors or something very close to our ancestors, there are signs that the dead began to be placed rather than simply left, that a body, instead of remaining where it fell or being carried away by the ordinary processes of the earth, was brought somewhere, set down with some degree of deliberateness, Perhaps covered. We do not know exactly when this began. The honest answer is that archaeologists continue to debate the earliest examples, weighing each candidate site carefully against the possibility that what looks like intention was something else entirely. But there are sites, old enough to quiet the room when you consider them, where the arrangement of bones, the position of a body, the depth and shape of a hollow in the earth has caused researchers to stop and wonder. Kafse Cave in what is now Israel, Shanidar in the mountains of northern Iraq, sites in Europe and Africa where the remains of early modern humans and even Neanderthals have been found in positions that seem, to careful eyes, to suggest something deliberate. A body curled on its side, knees drawn toward the chest, in a posture that appears too consistent, too sheltered to be entirely accidental. A shallow depression in the earth that might have been dug or might have been a natural hollow that someone thought to use. Each of these sites carries uncertainty, taphonomy, that patient science of how things are moved and changed and rearranged by time, reminds archaeologists at every turn that what looks purposeful may not be. Soil can shift a skeleton into positions that suggest curation when there was none. The walls of a cave can create hollows that look like graves. An animal bone found near a human skeleton may have arrived there entirely independently, carried by water or by the same carnivores that might have deposited the bones in the first place. And so the debate continues, as it should. Scholars who have spent careers studying these sites do not agree on which examples constitute genuine burials and which remain ambiguous. That disagreement is not a failure. It is an accurate reflection of how difficult it is, across this kind of distance, to separate the deliberate from the accidental, the meaningful from the merely coincidental. But imagine, for a moment, what the archaeologists imagine. A small hollow perhaps, not deep. The depth of a sleeping body, roughly the depth of rest. The soil in this part of the landscape is soft enough that hands or simple tools could have shaped it, enlarged it, prepared it in some basic way. And into this hollow a body is placed, a person who was known, who had a face that other faces recognized, who had, until recently, been part of the ordinary motion of the group, the foraging, the fire-tending, the accumulated habits of shared life. The body is curled, perhaps, the way a person curls in sleep, and then there is earth, or perhaps stones, placed over, around, some gesture of covering that means, in some way we cannot fully name, that this person is now in a different category from the living. We do not know if words were spoken. We cannot know. We do not know if there was sound, keening or silence or something between them. We only know, or suspect, or carefully consider the possibility, that the living did not simply walk away and leave things as they were. Near some of these early skeletons there are objects, a stone tool lying close, animal bones in proximity, fragments that might, or might not, have been placed there deliberately. The presence of such objects has led some researchers to speak of offerings, the earliest imaginable form of providing for the dead, sending something along, acknowledging that whatever the dead were going toward, they might need something, or that the living needed to give something, even if no clear theology existed to explain why. But here too, caution. A stone tool lying near a skeleton may have been used by the person in life and simply remained when they died. Animal bones may reflect the same deposits that brought other organic material to the same location. The step from objects found near the dead to objects placed with the dead is a large one, and the evidence rarely forces us clearly across it. What we are left with, in most cases, is a suggestion, a pattern that might mean something and might not, a question the earth poses without answering. Some researchers frame these early burials where they accept them as such, in entirely practical terms. a body left in or near a living area becomes a problem. Carrying it away from the camp, placing it in a hollow, covering it. These could be acts of sanitation as much as ceremony. The step from practical disposal to something more emotionally or symbolically charged may have been gradual, or it may have happened in a single gesture of grief that we can no longer see. What seems possible, more than possible perhaps, is that both things were true at once, that the practical and the emotional were not yet separated in the way we might separate them, that covering a body was simply what you did, and that in doing it you were also, without necessarily being able to articulate it, acknowledging something about the person you had lost. The two impulses, the practical and the tender, may have been so woven together that to distinguish them would have been meaningless to the people performing the act. There is something almost unbearable to contemplate in the image of it. The smallness of the hollow, the weight of the body being lowered, the hands that had known that body, perhaps fed it, been fed by it, rested near it through cold nights, placing earth or stone over what remained, and then the walking away, the return to the living, the world that continued without the person who was now behind them, covered, still. What did they carry walking away from that place? Not an articulated understanding of mortality, almost certainly, not a theology or a philosophy, but something, some weight in the chest that was new or newly recognized, some awareness, perhaps barely formed, that the world had a category it had not seemed to have before, a category of those who were placed in the earth and didn't return. And if that awareness was there, if it was, in however dim and wordless a form, then these early burials are not merely archaeological curiosities. They are something almost staggering to consider. They are the first material traces of humans treating the dead differently from the living. The first evidence, however tentative, that the boundary between the living and the dead was not simply biological, but was also in some way recognized, honoured, marked, not with monuments, not with ceremony we would name as such, but with a hollow in the earth and a body placed carefully and something in the people who walked away that was different from what it had been before. That is where it begins, or where we can first barely see it beginning, in the quiet of an ancient landscape, in an act so small the earth nearly swallowed all evidence of it. And yet here we are, still trying to read it, still pausing over bones in soil, asking what it meant, still, perhaps, doing something very similar ourselves. And then, at some point, it was not only the body. Something else went into the earth, something chosen, or something that felt impossible to leave behind. A tool that had been handled so many times its edge carried the memory of a particular grip. A piece of jewellery, if we can call it that, a string of pierced shells or animal teeth, that had been worn against skin, close to warmth, present in life in the most intimate way. A portion of food, perhaps, an animal bone placed with a deliberateness that, to certain careful eyes, looks different from mere proximity. These are the burials that archaeologists sometimes describe as furnished, the graves that contain something more than the dead. They appear, these furnished graves, in the deeper record of our prehistory, not universally, not consistently, but enough times, in enough places, and with enough apparent intention that researchers have paused over them and asked what they suggest about the minds that made them. What it means, across tens of thousands of years, to have placed an object beside a person before covering them with soil. The interpretations are many, and they are honest in their uncertainty. Some researchers suggest that grave goods, the formal term though it carries its own assumptions, may reflect a belief that the dead were going somewhere, that wherever they were going they might need things, that a tool placed beside a body was not simply an object but a provision, a kind of sending along, a gesture that only makes sense if some part of the living mind imagined the dead continuing, not here, not in the body that could no longer move or speak or eat, but elsewhere, in some adjacent realm that the living could not see, but could perhaps, in dim and wordless ways, sense or imagine or feel their way toward. If that interpretation is right, then these graves are something remarkable. They are the first material evidence we have of humans imagining an afterlife, or something like one, not a theology, not a heaven or an underworld with names and rules and geography, but an elsewhere, a somewhere that death opened onto rather than simply ending everything at. And yet we must hold that interpretation alongside the others. Objects placed with the dead may have reflected social standing rather than spiritual belief, a way for the living to communicate through the treatment of the body, something about who this person had been. The richness of a burial, the care taken with it, may have been a statement addressed not to the dead or to whatever waited beyond death, but to the other living people who witnessed it, a display of grief, of status, of belonging, of the weight of the loss. Or the objects may have been placed not because anyone imagined the dead using them, but because the living could not bear to keep them, because a tool that had been held by particular hands was now unbearable to hold in other hands, because the act of placing it in the grave was a way of letting something go, giving back to the person what had been most closely associated with them, not as provision for a journey, but as an act of memory, of honouring, of grief in its most physical form. We cannot know across this kind of distance which explanation was true for any particular burial. Very possibly all of them were true at once, in proportions that shifted from person to person and group to group, wound together in the same gesture without the people making it needing to separate them into categories we would recognise. But imagine the act itself, the slowness of it, a body resting in its hollow, in the posture of sleep or of departure, and the people who had known it gathering what seemed right to send with it. The choosing, which must have meant something, not every object, but these objects, this one in particular. The hands that carried it to the graveside and placed it carefully, gently, in the way you place something you do not want to damage. Near the hands, perhaps, or near the head, somewhere that felt correct in a way that may not have had a name, and then the soil, beginning at the edges and working inward, each handful covering a little more of the person, of the objects placed with them, of the particular arrangement of things that would never be arranged this way again. The sound of earth on earth, which is a sound that, once you've heard it in that context, you never quite unhear. And gradually the surface of the grave becoming only surface, only earth, ordinary looking except that it was not ordinary, except that something was held inside it, held the way you might cup water in your hands. The people who walked away from those graves were doing something that we cannot fully name, but the word that keeps suggesting itself across the distance of all that time is something like belief. Not belief in a formal or doctrinal sense, but belief in the way that belief begins, as a feeling that does not yet have language, a sense that the act being performed matters in some way that extends beyond the practical, that the person placed in the earth was still, in some form, a person, that the objects placed with them were not simply objects, that the covering of the grave was not simply the closing of a wound in the earth. When a community performed these acts together, something was happening between them as well as for the dead. A shared language was being formed or reinforced around what death was and what it deserved. A shared sense that the dead were still in relationship with the living, that the bond did not simply end when the body stopped moving, that there was an obligation, soft, wordless, felt rather than stated, to send the dead well, to accompany them to the edge of wherever they were going. That sense of the dead as still somehow present, still somewhere, still in some way connected, may have been one of the most important things early humans developed, not because it was factually accurate in any way we can verify, but because of what it did to the living. It made death into something that had a shape, something that could be responded to with gesture and intention rather than simply experienced as a rupture, an absence, a silence where a presence had been. It made death into a passage, not necessarily a passage to anything specific or describable, but a passage nonetheless, a threshold, something you could in some small way accompany a person to. And in doing so, in placing the tool and the shell and the bone in the earth, alongside someone who had once used them, the living were also doing something for themselves. They were reaching across the boundary that frightened them. They were saying in the only language available, the language of gesture, of placement, of chosen objects, something that sounds, translated very loosely and across a very great distance, like, "You are still known to us. You are still, wherever you are, provided for. You do not go entirely alone." Whether anyone or anything received that message we cannot say, but the act of sending it changed the people who sent it, made them, in some dim way, different from what they had been before, made them the kind of creatures who not only buried their dead but furnished the burial, who imagined, however faintly, that the dead were going somewhere worth preparing for. That is a long way from the animal that simply moves on when one of its number falls, and it is, in some quiet and fundamental way, a step toward everything that came after. And sometimes it was not only objects that accompanied the dead, sometimes it was colour. In a number of prehistoric burials, archaeologists have found traces of red ochre, a soft iron-rich earth, ground into powder, vivid even after immense stretches of time. It appears on bones, in the soil around them, on grave walls, in patches and clouds and stains that seem difficult to explain as accident alone. Again and again, in different places and periods, this red earth returns, and each time it does, it exerts a quiet fascination, because colour is rarely neutral when it is used with care. Colour chosen and placed beside the dead seems to ask something of us. It asks us to imagine not only what people did, but what they felt they were doing. Red ochre is among the oldest pigments known to human beings. It was used in many contexts, on bodies, on objects, on stone, perhaps in ways both sacred and ordinary. So when it appears in graves, we are left with possibilities rather than conclusions. The evidence suggests intention, but intention is not the same thing as meaning, and meaning is the part that recedes from us. One common idea is that the ochre may have stood for blood, for life itself, or for the warmth and force of being alive. A body that had gone pale and still might be covered, or partly covered, in the colour of what had left it. Not as a denial of death, perhaps, but as a response to it. A way of returning something symbolically to the dead. A way of giving back in earth form the colour that the body no longer possessed. Others have suggested transformation, red as the colour of passage, of change, of movement from one state to another. Not life restored exactly, but life acknowledged, or life translated. The dead person no longer among the living, but not simply reduced to absence either. Ochre, in that reading, becomes a material of threshold, a pigment for crossing, and yet archaeologists are careful here, as they must be. Red may have had symbolic meanings we can only guess at, but it may also have had practical or aesthetic uses. It preserves, it covers, it alters the appearance of skin and bone and earth. Perhaps it was valued because it was beautiful, perhaps because it was striking, perhaps because this particular powder had long been important in other parts of life, and so it naturally found its way into death as well. A community does not always divide the practical, the beautiful, and the sacred into separate compartments. Very often they are folded into one another so completely that to ask which one was primary is already to ask the wrong question. Still, the image remains powerful. A body lowered into the ground and dusted with red earth. A face perhaps touched with pigment, hands stained, soil transformed by colour so that the grave was no longer only a hollow in the ground, but a place marked out from ordinary earth. Not brighter exactly in our imagination, but more deliberate, more held. If grave goods suggested that the dead might be accompanied, ochre suggests that the dead might be prepared. There are other hints too, softer and even more uncertain. In some burials, researchers have found concentrations of pollen, and from this has come one of the most tender and debated ideas in all of prehistory, that flowers may have been placed with the dead. It is an idea people are understandably drawn to. Flowers feel instantly legible to us. Their beauty is brief. They belong to ceremonies of love, celebration, apology, remembrance. To imagine them in a grave tens of thousands of years old is to feel for a moment an almost unbearable closeness to those vanished people. Someone bent over a body and laid blooms beside it. Someone chose colour and softness and fragrance for the dead. Someone, in grief, reached for what living things offer at the edge of loss. But here too the evidence is debated. Pollen can arrive in a grave in more than one way. It can be moved by wind, by water, by the activity of burrowing animals, by later disturbance in the soil. It does not always testify to a bouquet laid by human hands. Some archaeologists think the famous cases are persuasive. Others are more cautious, and perhaps caution is wise. The past is full of traces that look eloquent until they are examined from another angle, and yet even with that uncertainty the possibility remains. Plant material of some kind may well have accompanied some of the dead. Leaves, grasses, branches, reeds, herbs, blossoms, not necessarily arranged as we would arrange flowers now, but placed as bedding, as covering, as offering, as part of the burial environment. A body might have rested not only on bare soil but on something softer, something gathered, something that carried the sense of the living landscape into the grave. That possibility matters, even if we cannot prove every detail, because it reminds us that early burial was not experienced only through sight. Death would have been encountered through all the senses, through the weight of the body, the coolness of skin, the smell of earth newly opened, the texture of hide or woven fibre or leaves against the hands. If pigments were used, there was colour. If plants were used, there was scent. There may have been the faint bitterness of crushed stems, the sweetness of blossom, the dusty dryness of powdered mineral. Mourning in such a setting was not an abstract feeling. It was physical. It entered the body through breath and touch as much as through thought. And perhaps that is part of what these traces tell us. Not exactly what early humans believed about death, but how they may have made death bearable, by changing the space around the dead, by refusing to leave the body in mere blankness, by adding something chosen, a colour, a covering, a fragrance, a texture, that said, without words, this is not neglect, this is attendance, this is care. A person dusted in ochre is not simply disposed of. A person laid among soft plants is not simply hidden away. Even if some of these materials served practical purposes, even if they helped with handling the body or preparing the grave, practicality itself can be tender. To prepare someone carefully after death is already to say something about them, about the bond that remains even when life has ended. It is tempting, looking at red ochre, to speak in large and certain terms, to say that here, finally, is proof of ritual, proof of symbolism, proof of spiritual consciousness flowering in unmistakable form. But the deeper honesty is quieter than that. The evidence suggests intentional decoration in at least some cases. It suggests that prehistoric people did more than place bodies in the ground and leave them to darkness. They altered the appearance of death. They surrounded it with chosen materials. They made it, in some measure, ceremonial. But what that ceremony meant to them from the inside, that we do not know, We do not know whether the red stood for blood or birth or return. We do not know whether flowers, where they were present, were offerings to the dead, protections for the living, signs of season, or simply beautiful things that felt right to include. We do not know whether those who performed these acts thought in symbols the way we do, or whether meaning lived for them in gesture itself, in the doing, the touching, the placing, the covering, without needing to be separated into explanation. What we can say is that death, by this point, seems to have become something shaped, not only endured, but arranged, given form through matter, through pigment, and perhaps through plants, through the old human instinct to answer loss with the hands. And there is something deeply moving in that. Across all the distance between their world and ours, across languages not yet born and beliefs never written down, we can still recognize the impulse to soften what is harsh, to mark what matters, to bring beauty or order or tenderness to the place where someone has gone still. Perhaps that is why these graves continue to hold us so strongly. Not because they solve the mystery of when humans first understood death, but because they preserve the trace of an emotional intelligence already taking shape. A refusal to let the dead become immediately anonymous, a sense that the final handling of a body should be done with attention. That colour belongs here, that texture belongs here, that maybe even scent belongs here too. The grave in this light becomes more than a hole in the earth. It becomes an environment of feeling, a place prepared by the living for the dead and perhaps also for themselves, a place in which grief could move through the senses and take on a form that the hands could manage, even when the heart could not. And from there, from bodies touched with pigment and perhaps laid among gathered plants, it is not such a large step to another kind of human threshold, one lit not by daylight, but by flickering thought, where darkness itself became a place of meaning, and stone walls began to receive images from minds already haunted by things beyond the visible. Beyond the grave cut into open ground, there was another kind of threshold waiting in prehistory. It lay inside the earth. Across parts of Paleolithic Europe, people moved into caves whose depths are still difficult to imagine calmly, unless we slow ourselves down enough to follow them. Not the broad entrances where daylight lingers and the outside world can still be felt, but chambers farther in, reached by crawling, stooping, turning through narrow passages, descending into spaces where the air cools and the darkness grows complete. In such places, ancient people painted. They left animals on stone walls and ceilings, bison, horses, aurochs, deer, lions, mammoths. They left dots, signs, handprints, abstract marks whose meanings are now hidden from us. And they did so not in comfort, not casually, but in conditions that required effort, intention, and, perhaps, a certain kind of courage. To enter such a cave by torchlight would have been unlike almost anything in ordinary daily life. The world outside would fall away quickly. Smell would sharpen. Sound would behave strangely. Flame would reveal one surface and conceal another. The rock would seem to move as shadows passed over bulges and hollows. A painted animal, caught in that shifting light, might appear less like an image placed on stone than like something halfway emerging from it. It is not difficult to understand why archaeologists and historians have long felt that these were not merely convenient shelters for art. The deeper painted caves especially seem to belong to another category of experience. What category that was is harder to say. Some researchers have suggested that caves may have functioned as liminal places, thresholds between ordinary life and some other realm. A person steps out of weather, out of daylight, out of the familiar landscape of trees and sky, and into the body of the earth itself. The cave becomes not only a location but a crossing. Perhaps it was imagined in some communities as a place close to spirits, or to powers not found on the surface. Perhaps it was connected in people's minds to an underworld, though that word carries later meanings we should use carefully. Still, the basic idea is a gentle one and a persistent one, that below the ground there might be another order of existence, another layer of presence, hidden but not empty. We cannot know for certain whether Paleolithic people thought in these terms. They left no written theology of stone and darkness, yet the evidence suggests that some caves were treated as special places, not simply because they were useful, but because they were set apart. Their remoteness matters. Their inaccessibility matters. People return to them, sometimes repeatedly, carrying pigment, light and intention into zones where no practical task would easily explain such effort. And in that effort, death begins to hover nearby, even if only at the edge of our interpretation. It is true that the most famous painted caves are not, in most cases, full of formal burials. They are not straightforward tombs. If we go looking for simple proof that cave art was directly a religion of death, we will not find it. Archaeologists are careful on this point, and rightly so. The relationship between these painted chambers and mortuary belief remains uncertain. But uncertainty is not emptiness. In some cave contexts, human remains have been found. Isolated bones, skull fragments, traces of human presence that suggest these spaces were used in more complex ways than one single explanation can contain. Some caves combine evidence of visitation, image-making, fire, movement deep underground, and at least occasional contact with the human dead. That does not give us a doctrine. It does, however, suggest a symbolic world richer than survival alone. Perhaps that is the important thing here. By the time people were venturing into deep caves to paint and mark the walls, they were already inhabiting landscapes of meaning. Stone was no longer only stone. Darkness was no longer only the absence of light. A hidden chamber could become a place one approached differently from the ordinary world. It could gather significance simply through being hard to reach, quiet, enclosed, and underground. And once a place acquires that kind of atmosphere, it is not difficult to imagine mortality finding a place there too. There is something deeply suggestive about the act of travelling downward with a flame in the hand. One leaves the surface, where life unfolds in weather and daylight, and enters the interior of the earth. The passage is gradual. Light narrows. Footing becomes uncertain. Time feels altered. The body must adjust. Breathing changes. Voices soften. Every movement becomes more deliberate. It is a descent, but also a separation. Behind you, the known world recedes. Ahead, there is only the next circle of light. For later cultures, journeys beneath the earth would often become powerful images for death and what followed it. We should not project those later myths too neatly backward, and yet the resemblance is difficult to ignore. Even in a very simple sense, going deep into a cave may have offered an experience that mirrored or helped people imagine some kind of passage beyond the ordinary boundaries of life. To move into the earth and then return from it would have been memorable. To do so as part of a meaningful act, painting, marking, perhaps chanting, perhaps sitting in darkness, may have carried emotional force that is now mostly beyond our reach. The experience itself invites comparison with other threshold states. Night, for one. Sleep, certainly. The cave closes around a person much as night closes around a camp. Vision weakens. Sounds become intimate. The world of clear edges gives way to suggestion. In such conditions, thought changes. Attention turns inward. Imagination becomes more active, not less. Shapes seem alive. Time loosens. One may feel both more alone and less alone, as if unseen things have drawn near. Some archaeologists and scholars have considered whether deep cave visits were connected to altered states of awareness. This remains debated, as many things do in prehistory, and the evidence cannot settle inner experience with precision. but the setting itself encourages the question. Darkness, flickering light, echo, fatigue, enclosed space, the anticipation of what lies beyond the next bend. All of these could produce a state of mind unlike ordinary waking life. A dreamlike quality seems almost built into the geography, and dreamlike states are often where human beings place the dead, the spirits, the half-remembered, and the not yet understood. If so, then caves may have offered not a literal map of an afterlife, but an emotional rehearsal for crossing into mystery, a place where one could feel, in the body, what it means to leave the familiar world and enter another condition, a place where the boundary between what is seen and what is imagined grows softer, and on those walls in that softness people painted. Why these animals? Why these signs? Why here, so far from daylight? The honest answer is that we do not know. The paintings may have been bound up with hunting, storytelling, memory, cosmology, initiation, seasonal practice, or forms of ritual now lost beyond recovery. They may have gathered many meanings at once. Human symbolism rarely stays obediently in one category. The same image can belong to food, fear, beauty, kinship, spirit, and death all at once. So we should be modest. We cannot say that Paleolithic cave art was about mortality in any single direct way, but neither should we imagine that death stood outside the symbolic worlds of the people who made it. Those worlds already seem layered, emotionally charged, and attentive to thresholds. They included the body, the earth, hidden spaces, powerful animals, darkness, return, and perhaps encounters with what could not be spoken plainly. In such a world, awareness of death would likely have found its place, even if we can no longer trace its outline cleanly. The caves keep their reserve. They offer us images, depths, and echoes, but not explanations. And perhaps that is fitting. For if early humans were beginning to understand death not only as an event but as a mystery, then the dark chambers of the earth may have felt like the right place to approach it, slowly, carefully, with fire in the hand, and with the knowledge that some meanings reveal themselves only in fragments, half-lit against stone. From those deep chambers of stone, we can move gently back toward the places where people lived. Not all encounters with the dead happened in caves or in graves set apart from daily life. In some prehistoric communities, the remains of certain people seem to have stayed very near the living. Not whole bodies, always, and not in ways that are easy for us to understand. Again and again in the archaeological record there appear skulls separated from skeletons, bones moved from one place to another, parts of the dead carefully kept, arranged, buried again, or placed in settings that suggest attention rather than neglect. The evidence is scattered across many regions and many centuries, but its emotional force is surprisingly direct. The dead, in some sense, remained close. A skull has a particular power even now. It carries the outline of the person more clearly than most other bones. The curve of the forehead, the jaw, the eye sockets, the teeth. These are enough for us to feel the nearness of a once-living face. Even after flesh is gone, the skull still seems to hold identity in a concentrated form. It is perhaps not surprising that, in many times and places, human communities treated skulls differently from the rest of the body. What is striking is how early this pattern may reach back. At several prehistoric sites, archaeologists have found signs that bodies were not always left undisturbed after burial. Sometimes skeletons appear incomplete, with skulls missing. Sometimes skulls are found gathered together apart from the rest of the dead. In some cases they seem to have been placed in pits or special locations. In others they were altered, plastered, painted, or handled in ways that suggest continuing social meaning. We must be careful, because each site has its own history, and not all separated skulls mean the same thing. Disturbance can happen for many reasons. Later burial activity can move earlier bones. Animals, erosion, and accident also complicate the record. But in at least some contexts, deliberate human action seems likely. By the Neolithic, when farming communities were building more permanent settlements, this closeness between the living and the dead may have become especially intimate. In some early villages of the Near East, for example, burials were placed beneath house floors. A person might be laid to rest below the ground of a dwelling where family life continued above. Meals prepared, children growing, tools repaired, sleep returning night after night to the same rooms, and sometimes, after decomposition, skulls may have been removed and kept separately. At certain sites, archaeologists have uncovered skulls that appear to have been modelled with plaster, with features shaped over the bone to recreate something of the face. Shells were sometimes placed where eyes had been. The effect, even described quietly, is difficult to forget. What did such acts mean? One interpretation, long discussed and still influential, is that these remains were connected to ancestor veneration. The dead were not simply disposed of and left behind. They remained members of the community in another condition. Their presence may have continued in houses, in shrines, in places of gathering, in the memory of descent and belonging. If this is so, then the keeping or displaying of skulls was not only about loss. It may have been about continuity. A lineage could be made visible. A household might live quite literally over its own past. The dead, changed by death, still took part in the social world of the living. There is something very human in that possibility. To keep the skull of a parent, a grandparent, or an elder nearby would be to refuse complete disappearance, not to deny death exactly, but to soften its finality. The person no longer speaks, no longer eats, no longer walks through the doorway. And yet the shape of the head remains. The place where the face once was remains. The family knows, this is one of ours. In that knowledge, absence and presence begin to coexist. Perhaps that coexistence was central. A community living among ancestral remains may have learned, in a very physical way, that death alters relationship without ending it. The dead cannot return to ordinary life, but neither are they simply nowhere. They are below the floor, within the wall, in the shrine, in the pit, in the remembered arrangement of bones brought out for some occasion, and then put carefully away. They are part of the architecture of belonging. The house shelters the living, but also gathers the dead into its meaning. This may have shaped time itself. A dwelling was no longer only the shelter of those presently breathing inside it. It became layered. Under one generation lay another. Beneath everyday life there rested an older life, and perhaps another beneath that. The home became a stack of memory, a place in which birth, work, sleep, aging, and death all belong to the same continuity. For people living this way, the boundary between the living community and the dead community may have felt thinner than it often does to us. Some scholars have suggested that shrines or special rooms containing skulls could have served as places where kinship, inheritance, and communal identity were reinforced. If the ancestors remained present, then claims to land, authority, and belonging might remain present with them. To remember the dead was also, perhaps, to remember who one was. The ancestors could authorize the living, bless them, watch them, or simply anchor them in a lineage that reached backward into a dim but meaningful past. And yet, archaeology is rarely content with one explanation, nor should it be. Other interpretations remind us that separated skulls and curated bones may also have been tied to power, fear, conflict, or social control. Not every skull need belong to a beloved forebear. Some may have belonged to enemies. Some may have functioned as trophies, warnings, or symbols of dominance. In other cases, the treatment of remains may reflect status differences within a community, or rituals whose emotional tone we can no longer recover. Reverence is one possibility, but not the only one. The same object can carry affection, awe, anxiety and authority all at once. There is also the simple truth that the dead can be difficult for the living. Love does not erase unease. A human skull is intimate, but it is also unsettling. To keep it near might express tenderness, but it might also acknowledge danger. The danger of forgetting, perhaps, or the danger of neglecting obligations to those who came before. Across many cultures, the dead are imagined not only as sources of blessing, but as beings who require care, attention, propitiation, respect. Presence is not always comforting. Sometimes it is solemn. Sometimes it asks something of the living. This is why these ancient practices feel so important to the history of human thought. They suggest minds capable of holding more than one truth at once. Someone is dead, unmistakably dead, reduced to bone. And yet that same person may still matter, still act, still belong, still inhabit social space. They are gone from one register of experience and present in another. Their body has changed state, but their place in the world has not entirely vanished. That layered understanding may be one of the deepest developments in the long human awareness of mortality. Death is not only an ending, it is also a transformation in status, memory, and relationship. The person crosses some boundary, but does not disappear cleanly from the lives of others. They remain in objects, stories, obligations, names, houses, and bones. They remain perhaps as ancestors, or as warnings, or as powers, or simply as the persistent fact that love does not know how to stop at the grave, and so the dead stayed near. Not only beneath the earth in hidden places, but in rooms, beneath floors, inside settlements, within the rhythm of domestic life. As human communities grew more settled, their relationships with the dead may have grown more settled too. Not simpler, but more enduring, more structured, more woven into everyday existence. The dead became part of where people lived, and perhaps part of how they understood themselves. From there, it is only a small step toward something larger, not just keeping the dead close, but building for them, remembering them in stone, and shaping whole landscapes around the fact that a life had been lived and must not be allowed to fade too quickly from the earth. From there, the scale begins to change. A skull kept in a house, a burial beneath a floor, a handful of bones placed with care in a chamber. These are intimate gestures. They belong to the nearness of family, to the enclosed world of kin and dwelling. But in many prehistoric landscapes, the dead began to gather into something larger than a household could hold. Stone by stone, mound by mound, communities raised tombs that didn't belong to one room or one family alone. They stood out on hills, along ridges, beside fields, near coasts, in places where sky and earth met with a certain quiet authority. Even now, after wind and weather have worn them down, these monuments can still seem patient and enormous. Archaeologists give them many names: megalithic tombs, passage graves, chambered cairns, long barrows, dolmens. The names differ by form and region, and each structure has its own history. We should be careful not to fold them all into one simple story. They were built over wide stretches of time and across different cultures. Their meanings may have varied greatly, and yet there is a broad shift here that is difficult to miss. The dead were no longer only being placed into the earth. In some places, they were being gathered into architecture. That change matters. To build in stone is to make a statement about duration. Earth settles. Wood decays. Memory frays at the edges. But stone resists. Not forever, perhaps, but long enough to outlast the hands that placed it. A community that hauls heavy slabs across uneven ground, that shapes chambers and passages, that piles cairns over the remains of the dead, is doing more than solving the practical question of disposal. It is investing labour, time, coordination, and intention into the fact of death itself. The tomb becomes a place where grief, identity, ancestry and landscape meet. And these places were rarely made in a single moment. The evidence at many sites suggests long histories of use. A chamber might receive remains again and again. Bones could be moved, sorted, added to, revisited. An entrance might be altered, a mound enlarged, a passage repaired, the whole monument renewed by later hands. Generations may have worked on the same tomb, just as generations may have entered it. One group dragged the first stones, another added to the cairn, another brought more of their dead, another stood outside it and knew that grandparents, and those before them, were already inside. There is a tenderness in that slowness. No one person, and perhaps no one lifetime, completed the meaning of such a monument. It accumulated. It deepened. The tomb became not only a container of remains, but a record of continuing attention. Each edition said, in effect, that the earlier dead still mattered enough to be joined by the later ones. A community could return to the same place over and over, and in doing so make memory collective. The dead were not only remembered as individuals, they were gathered into a larger ancestry, a shared past held in common. This may be one reason these monuments came to dominate certain landscapes. They made memory visible. To live near such a structure would be to orient oneself around it almost unconsciously. It would be there in ordinary weather, under cloud and dawn and winter rain. Children would grow up seeing it. People would pass it on the way to fields or grazing land. Visitors would notice it. Stories would gather around it even if we can no longer recover them. The dead, through stone, became part of the public world, not hidden entirely beneath the private life of a household, but placed into the land itself. Some of these tombs also appear to have been aligned, or at least related in suggestive ways, to the movements of the heavens. Archaeologists have long noted possible orientations towards sunrise or sunset at particular times of year, or toward recurring positions of the moon and stars. The famous examples are debated in detail, and not every proposed alignment is convincing. Chance, later disturbance, and modern enthusiasm can all mislead us. We cannot know for certain what every angle meant. Still, in at least some cases the pattern may be meaningful. If so, then these monuments were doing something profound. A passage that fills with light at midwinter, a chamber turned toward a seasonal sunrise, a tomb that seems to mark recurrence rather than mere ending. These possibilities suggest that the dead were being placed within a larger order of time. The sun disappears and returns. The year declines and renews itself. Darkness lengthens, then yields. For people who had begun to watch seasons closely, especially in farming communities, such cycles may have carried emotional as well as practical power. Death is final for the individual, but nature does not remain in one state. Seeds go into the ground and later rise. Light weakens and then grows. A tomb aligned with such rhythms might hint, however cautiously, at continuity beyond visible loss. Not necessarily resurrection in any later formal sense. We should not project too much, but perhaps a feeling that death belonged to a cycle rather than to pure obliteration, or perhaps simply a desire to place the dead within the same cosmic pattern that governed crops, animals, weather, and human lives. The evidence suggests concern not only with bodies, but with timing, return, and the repeated structure of the world. And then there is the experience of entering such a place. A stone passage narrows, air cools, sound changes, light falls away. At the centre lies a chamber where bones have rested, sometimes for many generations. Not one body always, but many. Fragments of lives reduced to pale remains in the dark. To step into such a space may have been solemn in ways we can still dimly feel. Here were the ancestors. Here were those whose names may once have been spoken, then perhaps forgotten, while their bones remained. Here was the evidence that all living bodies move towards stillness. It is difficult not to imagine that such encounters would have shaped the inner life of the living. A young person entering for the first time might see not just the dead of the past, but a future condition of the self. This too is where I will go. Not today perhaps, not soon, but one day. Stone chambers full of ancestral bones may have taught mortality with unusual force, not as an abstract idea, but as a physical truth shared across generations. At the same time, these monuments were almost certainly not only spiritual in purpose. Large communal tombs require organization. They gather labor. They define territory. They may strengthen alliances between families or lineages. They may create places for ceremony, feasting, negotiation, or the display of authority. To claim descent from those in the tomb could also be to claim land, status, and belonging. The monument says, "We've been here, our dead are here, this place holds our past." In that sense, memory becomes social power. Reverence and politics do not exclude one another. They may have grown together. So even where belief remains beyond our reach, the effort itself speaks clearly. These communities spent astonishing energy on the houses of the dead. They moved earth, lifted stone, returned across generations, and fixed remembrance into the land. Whatever they thought happened after death. Death had become central to how they imagined themselves together. A people was not only the living gathered in the present, it was also the dead behind them, enclosed in stone, holding open the depth of time. And from there, something even less visible begins to emerge. Stone can endure for thousands of years. Bone can remain in the ground. Ochre can stain. A chamber can hold its shape long after the hands that built it are gone. But words are lighter than all of these. They pass through the air, settle for a moment in the mind of another person, and vanish unless they are spoken again. For most of human history they left no trace that archaeology could lift from the earth, and yet it may be in words more than in stone that death became something fully shared. A burial tells us that the dead mattered. A tomb tells us that memory was organized. Grave goods suggest hope, fear, duty, or love. But language opens another room entirely. Once people begin to tell stories about death, to name it, to give it causes and pathways and personalities, the silence around a body becomes part of a larger human conversation. The question is no longer only what was done with the dead, it is also what was said. We cannot hear the earliest versions of those sayings. They are lost to us almost by definition. Long before writing, people must have sat near fires, or beneath roofs of reed and timber, or in the shelter of caves and tried to explain what no one could finally explain. Why does breath leave? Where has the person gone? Why do the old fail, the sick fade, the strong sometimes collapse without warning? Why must love end in separation? The evidence cannot preserve those first answers, but it would be surprising if there were none. By the time writing appears, mortality is already surrounded by reflection. The earliest written traditions we possess from Mesopotamia do not speak of death as a new discovery. They speak of it as an old wound. In the cities between the Tigris and Euphrates, scribes pressed wedge-shaped signs into clay tablets, and in those marks we begin to hear voices that feel startlingly familiar in their unease. The poems and myths that survive from Sumer and later Akkadian traditions show a world in which death is not a simple event but a problem of meaning. The Epic of Gilgamesh is perhaps the most famous example, though it comes to us through layered versions and long transmission. At its heart is grief. A king loses his companion. He sees, perhaps for the first time with unbearable clarity, that strength does not protect anyone from the grave. What follows is not only an adventure but a human recoil from extinction. Gilgamesh wanders in search of a way beyond death, and what he finds is not rescue, but limit. The story does not erase mortality. It circles it, argues with it, mourns it. It asks what a person should do when faced with the knowledge that life ends. That question does not seem like the beginning of awareness. It seems like the flowering of a much older one. Behind these written myths there likely stood many generations of spoken telling. Scribes did not invent grief when they picked up a stylus. They inherited forms of speech that had already been shaped in the mouths of storytellers, mourners, priests, parents, elders. A written text may preserve only the late surface of a much deeper current. Somewhere far behind the clay tablets, beyond recovery, there were likely nights in which people told of how death entered the world, why humans do not return, or where the dead travel after their last breath. Those stories may have changed with every retelling. They may have differed from village to village, but the impulse behind them feels ancient. To tell a story about death is, in a quiet way, to refuse pure chaos. A death without narrative can seem unbearable because it arrives as interruption, rupture, theft. But once death is given a place in a story, it becomes at least partially thinkable. If death is a road, then one imagines a traveller. If it is a gate, then perhaps there is passage. If it is a sleep, then there is rest. If it is a judgment, then a moral order exists beyond the grave. If it is a return to the earth, to the ancestors, to the waters, or to the sky, then loss is framed within belonging. None of these stories remove pain, but they may soften its shapelessness. Perhaps this is why so many cultures gave death a face. Sometimes death appears as a deity, a lord or lady of an underworld, a collector, a guide, a guardian of thresholds. Sometimes it is not a person exactly, but a force with intention, a boundary that cannot be crossed, a realm governed by rules. To imagine death in this way may have helped people approach what otherwise remained too vast and impersonal. A named thing can be spoken to, feared, bargained with, cursed, placated. A faceless ending is harder to live beside. Different societies seem to have framed the passage very differently, and those differences matter. In some traditions, death becomes a journey away from the village of the living toward a distant land of shadows. In others, it is a separation of body and breath, flesh and spirit, house and inhabitant. Elsewhere it may be imagined as a return, the dead joining ancestors, soil, stars, or cycles of renewal already present in the natural world. And in some stories, death is transformation, a crossing into another form of existence rather than a simple disappearance. Each of these shapes carries an emotional tone. A journey suggests movement through uncertainty. A separation emphasizes absence and grief. A return offers belonging, perhaps even comfort. A transformation leaves room for wonder, but also unease, because the person who continues may no longer be the person who was known. Myths are not only explanations, they are records, however indirect, of feeling. Through them we can sense resignation, protest, tenderness, fear, hope, and the desire to place private sorrow within a pattern larger than one household's loss. This does not mean myth preserves the first moment when human beings realized they would die. That moment, if there ever was such a singular moment, lies far beyond the reach of text. Awareness may have come gradually, unevenly, deepening over immense spans of time. Myths cannot show us the beginning with certainty. What they do show is something else, and perhaps something just as important. They reveal societies already deeply preoccupied with impermanence. By the time people wrote of underworlds, grieving heroes, divine decrees, and the fragile span of human life, death had become not only a biological fact, but a subject for imagination. It had entered language. It could be argued with, lamented, personified, ritualized. It could be fitted into poems, prayers, genealogies, and sacred histories. The dead were no longer only bodies in tombs. They were also characters in stories, residents of unseen realms, members of continuing moral and cosmic dramas. And once death lives in story, it can travel very far. It can move from one generation to the next without a monument. It can be carried in memory, repeated in childhood, whispered in mourning, recited in ceremony. It can enter the mind early, long before one has seen much of the world. A child hears that people go somewhere, or become something, or are gathered by someone, and the fact of mortality begins to take shape, not only as fear, but as narrative. The unknown acquires contours, so the record changes here, gently but profoundly. We leave behind a world in which the dead speak only through bones, pigments, and stone, and we enter one in which the living begin to answer death with words, not final answers, not answers that end sorrow, but human answers all the same, fragile and enduring in their own way. And from these stories, little by little, whole civilizations would build their arts of dying. And so, as villages became towns and towns became cities, death moved closer to the centre of public life. In earlier ages, a grave may have lain at the edge of a settlement, or beneath a house floor, or in a cave known only to a few. But in the first great civilizations, the dead became part of an organized landscape. Tombs rose in stone, cemeteries spread beyond walls, ancestors were named, counted, visited, supplied, and remembered through systems that could endure across generations. Mortality was no longer only a private sorrow or a local custom. It had become something administered, recorded, and shaped by institutions. In ancient Egypt this is especially clear. Along the Nile, where the river's rhythms may have encouraged long habits of order and renewal, death seems to have been approached with extraordinary care. Bodies were prepared so that they might remain intact. Tombs were furnished with food, clothing, vessels, images, and written spells or instructions. The evidence suggests that what happened after death was not imagined as a vague darkness alone, but as a passage requiring knowledge, protection, and correct ritual attention. One did not simply die. One had to be helped into death properly. The Egyptian funerary texts that survive in different forms across long stretches of time give us a quiet sense of this concern. They are not merely expressions of grief. They are guides, protections, and perhaps rehearsals for a journey that was expected to matter. We need not enter too deeply into doctrine to feel their human purpose. They suggest that people wanted the dead to know the right names, to avoid danger, to arrive safely, to remain themselves. Beneath the formal language lies a familiar wish, that those we lose should not be lost completely. The tomb itself became a kind of conversation between worlds. Some were modest, others grew vast. In the great royal monuments, memory was made architectural. Stone chambers, carved passages, painted walls, sealed rooms filled with objects for use beyond death. These do not look like gestures of denial. They look rather like an attempt to make death livable through preparation. If the grave could be supplied, ordered, beautified, and protected, then perhaps the terror of disappearance could be met with craft. Mesopotamia offers a different tone, though no less serious. In the cities of the river plains, where flood, war, kingship, trade, and labour shaped daily life, the dead also received structured attention. Burials varied across time and place, and archaeologists continue to debate the meanings of many finds, but the pattern is clear enough to be felt. The dead were placed with goods, tombs could express rank and kinship, offerings continued. The boundary between the living household and the remembered dead may not always have been sharp. Here, too, mortality seems woven into the fabric of civic existence. A person lived under laws, paid obligations, served rulers or temples, and eventually entered the company of the dead, who were not forgotten simply because they were gone from sight. Some texts from Mesopotamia speak with great sobriety about the underworld, not always hopefully, but with a sense that death belonged to an ordered universe. Even where the afterlife appears dim, rituals still mattered. Care for the dead still mattered. To be buried properly and remembered by descendants was not a small thing. It may have been one of the ways a fragile human life remained anchored after its ending. In the Indus region, the picture is quieter, because the script of that civilization remains undeciphered, and so much of its inner language is still beyond us. We must move gently here. Yet even in silence, patterns appear. Cemeteries existed. Bodies were placed with care. Grave goods, though often less dramatic than in Egypt, suggest that death was not treated as mere disposal. In cities planned with remarkable regularity, where streets, drains, and neighbourhoods seem to reflect a disciplined social order, it is difficult not to wonder whether similar order extended into ideas about death and remembrance. We cannot know for certain what stories were told there, or how the dead were imagined after burial, but the evidence suggests deliberate custom rather than indifference. Early China also reveals a world in which the dead remained socially powerful. In Neolithic and Bronze Age contexts, graves range from simple to richly furnished, and over time some tombs became elaborate underground residences for those who had died. Objects placed beside the dead could include vessels, tools, ornaments, chariots, and things made for ceremony. Ancestors appear to have occupied a continuing place in the moral imagination of the living. The dead were not always thought of as absent in a final sense. They could remain involved, responsive, perhaps even demanding. This may have shaped ordinary life in profound ways. To live in a city where burial grounds stood beyond the walls, where ancestral tablets or tombs were visited, where old rulers rested in monumental precincts, was to grow up with death not hidden but arranged. Children may have learned names of the dead as part of family identity. Adults may have passed funerary processions in the street, seen mourners in prescribed garments, heard prayers or laments carried across courtyards, known the annual duties owed to those who'd gone before. The dead had addresses, they had ceremonies, they had legal and social weight, and this may be one of the great changes. Once mortality is woven into the life of a civilization, dying well becomes a moral task. It matters how one is buried, who performs the rites, what is spoken, what is left behind, and whether descendants continue the chain of remembrance. To die without proper care may have seemed not only sad but dangerous, incomplete, or unjust. To remember the dead correctly was part of being a good child, a rightful ruler, a faithful spouse, a stable community. Grief entered law, ritual entered administration, art entered mourning. By this stage of history, the knowledge that all humans must die no longer appears only in graves and stories. It seems to be built into the structure of society itself. It is present in tomb architecture, in inherited ceremonies, in official texts, in family obligation, in carved stone and painted walls and carefully arranged offerings. Death has become not an interruption, outside culture, but one of culture's organizing facts. And from that deep settling of mortality into civilization, another kind of response begins to emerge. Not only how to bury the dead, but how to think about death while still alive. And from that question, carried inward rather than carved in stone, there slowly emerges a different kind of human labour. If tombs and rituals were ways of doing something about death, philosophy may have been one of the first sustained attempts to look at it without turning away, not to conquer it, and not always to explain it fully, but to examine the fear itself, to ask what exactly troubles us when we imagine our own ending, and whether clear thought might soften what instinct makes sharp. This does not happen in one place only, across different civilizations, in different languages, With different assumptions about the soul, the body, memory, duty, and the cosmos, men and women began to speak of death not only as an event to prepare for, but as a subject for reflection. The traditions do not merge neatly. They often disagree, yet they seem to share a quiet recognition that mortality can be thought about carefully, perhaps even lived with more gently if it is brought into the light of reason. In the Greek world, this inquiry took many forms. Some thinkers asked what a human being truly is and whether anything in us survives the body's decline. Others were less certain. For some, the soul appeared enduring, capable of existing beyond death in another state. For others, death was closer to a dispersal, a return of elements to a wider nature. We should be careful not to force agreement where there was none. Greek philosophy was never one settled voice speaking calmly from a single chair. It was a long conversation, often restless, sometimes argumentative, and always shadowed by the fact that the speakers themselves would die. One of its most enduring gestures was simple. If death frightens us, perhaps we should ask why. Is it painful? Is it the loss of pleasure? Is it separation from those we love? Is it punishment? Is it nothing at all? To ask such questions does not erase sorrow, but it changes the posture of the mind. Fear, once examined, may become more precise, and what is more precise may sometimes become less overwhelming. Some Greek schools seem to have thought that philosophy was in part a preparation for death, not because life was unimportant, but because a good life required some settlement with its ending. To live always fleeing death inwardly may have seemed to them a kind of servitude. Better perhaps to understand what can be controlled and what cannot. Better to train the mind towards steadiness. Better to practice letting go, a little at a time before the final letting go arrives. Elsewhere in the ancient world, Indian traditions developed reflections on death that were equally searching, though often framed within very different visions of existence. Here too we must move carefully because these traditions are vast, layered, and internally diverse. Yet the evidence suggests that many thinkers were less concerned with a single death alone than with a much larger cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. If life returns in altered form, then death may not be the simple opposite of living. It may be a passage within a continuing process, shaped by action, attachment, knowledge, and release. This did not necessarily make mortality easier. In some teachings, the problem was not merely that humans die, but that they die again and again, bound to change, loss, and longing. The question then became not only how to face one death bravely, but how to understand the deeper condition that makes beings vulnerable to suffering at all. Some sages seem to have answered with renunciation, some with insight, some with disciplined practice, some with devotion. The paths differed, but beneath them lies a familiar tenderness, the recognition that human beings are troubled by impermanence, and that this trouble deserves patient thought. Chinese traditions too offer their own measured ways of approaching the end. In some strands of thought, the emphasis falls less on speculation about what survives death, and more on the work of living rightly within family, society, and the pattern of heaven and earth. If one fulfills duties, honours ancestors, acts with balance, and accepts the rhythm of change, then death may appear less as a scandal than as part of an order larger than the self. In other strands, especially those more associated with withdrawal and harmony with the natural way, death could be regarded with a certain spaciousness. The living thing changes form. Seasons pass. What seems final from one point of view may from another be part of an ongoing transformation. None of these traditions remove grief. A parent still dies. A child still dies. Friends still part from one another. But philosophy sometimes offered a place where grief and fear could be held without panic. It proposed that the mind need not meet mortality only with avoidance or despair. It could also meet it with discipline, attention, and language matters here. Once thoughts about death are written down, they begin to travel farther than a funeral procession can go. A teacher speaks to students who preserve the words. A thinker writes in old age, wondering what remains worth saying as the body weakens. A dialogue survives, a verse survives, a short instruction copied by hand survives. Across centuries another reader finds it, perhaps at night, perhaps in private sorrow, and hears in it not a doctrine alone, but a person trying, with whatever tools were available, to make sense of being mortal. This may be one of the quiet revolutions in the history of death. Burial preserves the body for a while, or the memory of a name. Writing preserves an inner struggle. Through it, we meet not only what a culture believed, but how particular individuals wrestled with finitude. Some sound serene, some sound uncertain, some reason their way toward calm, some circle the question without resolving it, and that too feels deeply human. The disagreements remained. Does something survive? A soul? A breath? A pattern? A moral consequence? A memory and descendants? Or nothing we would recognize as a self? Philosophical schools often answer differently, and their arguments echo much older debates carried in myth, ritual, and family custom. The philosopher did not replace the priest, the mourner, or the storyteller. More often another voice entered the room, yet the long arc is unmistakable. What may once have been only a dim unease, scarcely separable from instinct, had become in many places a subject of deliberate reflection. Humans were no longer only burying their dead, ornamenting graves, consulting ancestors, or telling stories of the world beyond. They were also asking with careful seriousness why death wounds the mind, how fear might be lessened, and whether the brevity of life is part of what gives it weight. For some, finiteness made each act more precious. For others, it urged detachment. For others still, it pointed toward liberation beyond the cycle of endings. There was no final agreement, and perhaps there never could be. But by now, mortality had entered thought as fully as it had entered ritual. And once people began reasoning openly about death, another promise slowly gathered strength, that beyond philosophy's questions there might be not only understanding but salvation. And once that promise appears, the mood changes slightly. Philosophy had often tried to steady the mind before the fact of death, but later religious movements in many parts of the world seem to have placed death, and what might follow it, much closer to the centre of human concern. Not always in the same way, and never with one universal answer, but with a shared seriousness that is difficult to miss. Death was no longer only a boundary to contemplate, or a sorrow to ritualize. It became, for many communities, a threshold on which eternal questions seemed to rest. This development was not sudden, and historians debate its paths. Beliefs grow through contact, memory, conflict, reinterpretation, and long periods of quiet change. One tradition borrows language from another, or resists it, or reshapes older symbols until they carry a different meaning. We cannot know every stage with certainty. The origins of doctrines about judgment, heaven, hell, rebirth, purification, liberation, or union with the divine are often layered and difficult to trace. But the broad movement is visible enough. Across large and enduring traditions, mortality became not merely an ending to endure, but a problem to answer. And the answers were powerful because they spoke directly to an old fear. If the deepest terror in death is annihilation, then one response is to say, "You will not simply vanish. Something essential continues. Perhaps the self survives to be judged. Perhaps life returns in another form. Perhaps what is most real in a person is not destroyed at all, but drawn back toward a divine source from which it came." These are very different visions, and we should not blur them into sameness. Yet all may be understood, at least in part, as human attempts to stand before extinction and say that disappearance is not the final truth. For some believers, what follows death became a scene of moral reckoning. The world, after all, does not distribute justice evenly. The cruel sometimes prosper. The kind often suffer. Children die. The innocent are forgotten. If death were only silence, then much would remain unresolved. Traditions of judgment may have answered this wound by imagining a final balancing, a place where hidden acts are known, wrongs are weighed, and the moral structure of the universe is revealed more clearly than it appears in ordinary life. Such beliefs could be frightening, certainly, but also consoling. They suggested that injustice is not ultimate, even when history makes it seem so. Other traditions, or currents within them, answered the fear of death less through judgment than through continuation. Rebirth, in its many forms, may have offered a way of understanding why life feels at once fleeting and unfinished. A single death would not close the story entirely. One existence would lean into another. But this too was not always simple comfort. In some teachings, repeated birth and death were themselves part of the problem, a long wandering through suffering, attachment, and loss. The promise beyond was therefore not merely that one would go on, but that one might eventually be released. And then there are traditions in which the deepest hope is neither courtroom nor return, but nearness. The soul, or the self, or whatever language a culture uses for the innermost person, longs for reunion with what is ultimate. Death in this vision may become not only separation from the world, but approach toward the divine. Sometimes this is imagined personally as meeting a loving presence, sometimes more mysteriously as merging, resting, dissolving into a reality larger than the individual mind. Here the fear of annihilation is answered not by preserving the ordinary self exactly as it was, but by transforming the meaning of loss itself. To be taken into what is highest may be presented not as destruction, but as fulfillment. What matters is that these religions did not usually offer explanation alone. They offered preparation. If death stands at the center of existence, then life must be shaped in relation to it. Prayer, repentance, confession, meditation, ethical discipline, almsgiving, ritual purity, remembrance, initiation, fasting, devotion, the recitation of sacred words, the care of the dying, the honoring of the dead. Such practices may have given believers a way to do something with their fear, rather than merely suffer it in silence. They turned the uncertainty of dying into habits that could be repeated, taught, shared, and carried from one generation to the next. This may be one reason religious traditions around death often feel so tender at the level of ordinary life. A person nearing the end is not left with an abstract theory alone. There are words to say, gestures to perform, stories to remember, companions to gather close. One prepares the soul, or settles the heart, or repairs what can still be repaired. Even where the theology is complex, the human need beneath it is plain enough. People want death to mean something. They want to meet it with more than panic, and the meanings offered were not all the same because the needs were not all the same. Some people longed most for comfort, the hope that death would not sever love forever. Some longed for justice, the assurance that cruelty would not have the last word. Some longed for reunion, with ancestors, with family, with saints, with God. Some longed for release, from pain, from guilt, from the wheel of repetition, from the weary burden of being a vulnerable creature in a changing world. Religious traditions seem, in part, to have endured because they could speak to these different aches at once, or at least hold them within a larger sacred frame. As communities grew larger and more complex, such shared beliefs may also have helped bind people together. A village can mourn with custom alone. A kingdom, An empire or a far-reaching religious community may need something broader. Common stories about why we die, how we should live, what awaits us, and how the living ought to care for the dead. In this sense, teachings about the afterlife were not only personal consolations, they may also have been social glue, linking ethics, authority, memory, and hope. Still, we should move gently here. Historians and theologians continue to debate how these beliefs formed, which influences mattered most, and how ordinary believers actually understood them. Formal doctrine and lived religion are not always the same. A sacred text may say one thing, a local custom another, and the heart of a grieving mother something quieter still. Yet across all this diversity one pattern remains. Humans did not stop asking what death is. They began asking with greater urgency what death is for, what lies through it, and how a mortal life should be lived if the grave is not the end, or if the grave is the doorway to judgment, return, reunion, or release. And once such hopes settle deeply into a culture, death no longer belongs only to philosophers, priests, or kings. It enters the homes of ordinary people, where grief is smaller in scale and no less profound. It enters the homes of ordinary people, and there it becomes both simpler and harder to understand. The monuments remain, the doctrines remain. The priests, the philosophers, the sacred books, the carved tombs, the painted walls, the promises of heaven or rebirth or release, all of these continue to shape the larger story. But most deaths in history did not happen in palaces or temples, and most grief did not announce itself in stone. It happened in small rooms, in farmhouses, in crowded streets, in tents, in villages, in boats, in winter cabins, in courtyards where laundry moved in the wind. It happened where people cooked, argued, mended clothing, told stories, and tried to sleep. This quieter history is harder to trace. The evidence is scattered and uneven. Archaeologists may uncover graves, offerings, and household shrines. Historians may read letters, law codes, prayer books, funeral records, and scraps of songs. Folklorists may preserve tales told by grandparents long after their original setting has faded. But the private feeling of losing a child, a sister, a husband, a friend, often leaves only the faintest mark. We cannot know the full texture of those sorrows, and yet it seems likely that they were among the most constant experiences human beings ever had. In many past societies, death was not hidden at the edges of life as it often is in the modern world. It was visible, familiar, and difficult to avoid. The dead might be washed at home by relatives. Bodies might rest for a time in the same house where the family ate and slept. Mourning clothes could mark grief in public, making sorrow something others recognized at a glance. Bells might ring, processions might pass through the street, candles might burn beside a household altar, names of the dead might be spoken at meals, on feast days, or during annual observances. In some cultures, ancestors were not thought of as gone in any final sense, but as members of the family whose presence still hovered near the living. To live in such a world may have meant growing up beside death rather than discovering it all at once. A child might see a grandparent weaken slowly through a season. Another might watch animals die and understand, dimly at first, that people were fragile too. A family may have worn black for months. A doorway may have held a wreath or a branch or a lamp to signal loss. In some places, ritual lament was public and expected. In others, restraint was honoured. But either way, children would have noticed the change in the adults around them, the lowered voice, the careful silence, the room no one entered for a while, the object no one moved, and sooner or later, perhaps in a whisper at bedtime, or while walking beside an older relative, or after a funeral that seemed too solemn to understand, a child may have asked the oldest human question in one of its smallest forms. Will that happen to me? It is impossible to know when, in any one life, that question first takes hold. Some children may ask without fully understanding the answer. Some may hear the word death many times before realizing that it applies to them as well. But at some point, for countless people across centuries, the thought must have crossed from the outside world into the inward self. Not only do people die, I will die. Not only sometime in stories, or to strangers, or to the very old. Me. What adults said in response must have varied as widely as belief itself. Some may have answered with religion. They may have said that everyone dies, but the soul goes onward, that the ancestors watch over us, that God receives the good, that this life is one passage in a longer journey, that the dead sleep until they are called, that death is part of the order of things, painful but not meaningless. Others may have answered more cautiously, perhaps because they themselves were uncertain. They may have said, "Not for a very long time," or "Do not be afraid," or simply, "I do not know." And perhaps this is one of the most human scenes in all of history. Not a king building a tomb, not a theologian shaping doctrine, but an ordinary adult, tired and loving and not entirely convinced by their own explanation, trying to place gentle words around a terror that has no perfect remedy. Cultures may have prepared children for this knowledge gradually. Lullabies, though often tender, are not always free from shadows. Folktales may move through forests of danger, winter, disappearance, return. Seasonal festivals may teach, in symbolic form, that living things fade and come back, that fields go barren and grow green again, that light diminishes and is renewed. Seeds are buried and rise. Leaves fall and return. Ancestors are remembered on appointed days and welcomed, in some traditions, almost as guests. Through these rhythms, children may have learned that loss belongs to the pattern of the world, even when the heart refuses the lesson. Still, symbols can only soften the edge. They do not remove it. For ordinary families in the past, death was often painfully near. Infant mortality was high in many societies. Disease could move quickly through a household. Childbirth was dangerous. War, famine, and accident were never far away. A mother might have buried more than one child. A child might have grown up with fewer siblings than were first born into the family. A person could know the shape of mourning before reaching adulthood. This did not make grief shallow. Familiarity is not the same as indifference. If anything, frequent loss may have deepened the rituals around death because sorrow needed somewhere to go. So people stitched grief into daily life. They wore it, sang it, prayed it, cooked for visitors who came after a burial, kept locks of hair, letters, small portraits, beads, amulets, names in family records. They returned to graves. They lit lamps. They told the dead person's stories again, sometimes with tears, sometimes with laughter that arrived later, when grief had loosened just enough to let memory breathe. Beliefs differed enormously. Some imagined reunion. Some imagined judgment. Some imagined rebirth. Some may have held only a vague sense of continuation, or none they could clearly define. Yet beneath these differences, the emotional structure feels hauntingly familiar. Sorrow for the one who is gone. Love that does not know where to go after loss. Fear of separation. Fear of one's own ending. The wish to protect children from what cannot be prevented. The wish, perhaps deepest of all, that death might not mean the disappearance of meaning. And this is where the longest history becomes intimate again. After all the burials, the pigments, the grave goods, the temples, the myths, the philosophies, the salvations, what remains is a single inward moment that may come to anyone. Perhaps it comes early, perhaps late, perhaps suddenly in the presence of a body, or slowly over years of noticing absence. But one day the truth turns and faces inward. the long human knowledge becomes personal. The ancient fact reaches one private mind. I am alive now, and one day I will not be. That realization may be among the oldest inheritances we possess, and no matter the century, no matter the language, it is often met first not with argument, but with quiet. And from that quiet the story widens once more. If we follow it back as far as we can, toward the dim places before written memory, before temples and doctrines and names for the soul, we do not find a clear threshold. We do not find one evening when humanity as a whole suddenly understood death and was changed forever. The evidence does not offer such a neat beginning. What it suggests more gently is a long unfolding. Somewhere deep in the older animal world there may already have been distress at absence, vigilance around a fallen companion, confusion, agitation, lingering attention. Among early humans and their relatives, these responses may have deepened into something more durable. Care for bodies, repeated returns to the dead, gestures that seem to have held meaning beyond immediate survival. Then, much later, or perhaps only gradually, graves begin to carry signs of intention. Bodies are placed carefully, pigment appears, objects are left nearby. Certain places are chosen again and again. The dead seem no longer only absent, but held in thought. From there the pattern grows richer. Burials may hint at memory. Grave goods may hint at continuation. Ochre may have coloured the dead with meanings we can only guess at. Caves may have gathered the living into darkness where images, animals, ancestors and unseen powers seem to meet. Skulls may have remained close to households, or been handled in ways that suggest reverence, fear, or kinship. Tombs rise, monuments endure, myths begin to speak where archaeology falls silent. Philosophers ask what death is. Religions answer with judgment, release, rebirth, paradise, union, awakening, return. And yet through all these changes, something remains unfinished. Human beings became extraordinarily skilled at surrounding death with language, ritual, and form. We built chambers for it, ceremonies for it, teachings for it, calendars for remembering it. We told stories to place it within an order. We made arguments to tame it with reason. We prayed over it. We painted it. We feared it. We entrusted it to gods. But even in the most elaborate traditions, a certain uncertainty often remains at the centre, quiet and undefeated. Perhaps that is why this history feels so long and so intimate at once. For all that archaeologists uncover, there are limits that cannot be crossed. A burial can tell us that a body was placed with care, but not exactly what was believed by the hands that laid it there. A grave good may suggest hope for an elsewhere, or it may have carried some meaning now lost entirely. Red ochre may have symbolized blood, life, earth, transformation, or something no modern language can quite recover. Written texts bring us closer, but even they do not open the whole interior world of the dead, or of those who loved them. We work from traces, we infer, we compare, we wonder. And often, with honesty, we must stop at perhaps. So the first true awareness of death may never be pinned to a single species, a single grave, a single century, or a single thought. It may have come in layers. First, the shock of stillness, then the memory of the one who does not rise, then the expectation of loss, then the terrible inward turn. This will happen to me. Not all at once, but slowly, across generations beyond counting, as minds became able not only to witness death, but to imagine it before it arrived. And if that is so, then each private fear of mortality belongs to a very ancient inheritance. Whenever you have felt, even for a moment, that strange widening inside the mind when it tries to imagine its own ending, you may have been standing in the same long current as countless others, a child beside a hearth, a mourner at a grave, a philosopher under the night sky, a hunter pausing near old bones, a monk in prayer, a mother keeping watch, a person in every age, carrying the knowledge quietly, somewhere behind the ordinary hours of living. There is comfort, perhaps, in not having a final answer. We may never know exactly when awareness began, or what death finally is, or whether the first people who buried their dead felt what we would recognize as hope, terror, tenderness, or all of these at once. But not knowing is not a failure of the human story. It is part of it. We live by meanings that are often partial. We love without guarantees. We ask questions larger than any evidence can fully settle. And still we go on, making room in our lives for wonder, for grief, for memory, for one another. So tonight, as you rest inside this old and unfinished mystery, you may let the question soften. You're not alone in it. You never were. Across uncounted generations, beneath different skies and among different beliefs, human beings have carried this same knowledge in fragile bodies and restless minds. They have feared it, shaped it, sung to it, argued with it, and laid it down beside the ones they loved. And now it comes to you as part of the same inheritance, not only the knowledge that life ends, but the strange tender fact of being alive enough to know it. May that be enough for this moment. May the unanswered things grow quiet around you, and may you rest gently within the shared and ancient mystery of being here at all for a little while before sleep carries you onward.